Hi, Danny here from the Joshua Tree, and thanks for joining us as we continue to work our way through one of Jesus' most famous sermons, often referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. And today we're looking at this final beatitude. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the persecuted. Seems like quite a strange idea. And perhaps as we sort of stop and think about how that actually might work out, that we might think about situations where those who were previously persecuted are now receiving great blessing. There's been much in the media this week about the upcoming Mardi Gras and a contrast about the original Mardi Gras, where there was a great protest movement, there was great public resistance. It required great courage and putting yourself out there to be involved. To now, where there's a high amount of commercial and public support. It's moved from being on a street to the Sydney Cricket Ground. And so perhaps you might think, okay, this is how those who have been persecuted are now blessed. Exalting of those who were involved in the original protest march, that they who received persecution at the time are now receiving blessing as being pioneers of this community and this movement. Jesus says, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Well, if we stop and think about the context with which Jesus was speaking, he was speaking to his disciples and the crowd. They've seen him do some amazing things, some healings. He's been starting to call people to turn from the way that they were living to begin following him. And I guess here he's building an expectation. And the expectation is probably that there is going to be a transition from being lowly to being exalted, to being a part of this kingdom that is heavenly, divine. But what really we see here is that this is just a progression from where the other Beatitudes have been. Jesus began his sermon by saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. You have to empty yourself before you can receive the blessing that comes from knowing Jesus and living as a part of his kingdom. It's this disposition of mourning over sin, a meekness with which we approach life. And then Jesus had talked about hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And so again, here we see that there is a development of what's gone before, and it's about acting it out in this life. And last week we saw in Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, blessed were the peacemakers. But following on from that, there's an expectation that those who are seeking to hunger and thirst for righteousness will face resistance. There will be persecution. So if we just stop and work our way through this beatitude again, the idea of being blessed that Jesus is talking about is being in sync with God's design. That someone could stand back and sort of look at the way that you're living and go, good on you, you're going well. It's going well for you. So the paradox with this is that blessed are the persecuted. Persecuted by nature means that you've been opposed, that you're being harassed, that you're experiencing some form of harm. Literally, it means to be pursued, chased, or driven away. It's not a desirable experience. There's nothing about being persecuted that evokes pleasure. To be excluded, to be pushed away from your values, your community, is something that is a real challenge. And so for those who are persecuted, often they're being persecuted because they're being invited to compromise their own beliefs, to change their allegiances, to conform. Now, people are persecuted for all range of reasons. Throughout history and even today, people are persecuted because of their race, their gender, their family background, their intellectual capacity, their socioeconomic stance. But most persecution arrives because an individual or a community is disrupting the status quo. That some level, people who are persecuted because they've offended those who are in power, or perhaps they're even seen as posing a threat. Now, activism has always been a part of our society, and those who are activists for particular causes or ideals often receive persecution. Often by speaking out or raising an issue, they then face opposition. They're driven away from the decision-making processes. They're encouraged to try and change or conform their beliefs. But we know with activism that the level of persecution that you receive doesn't necessarily correlate with your ability to succeed. Not all activism brings about change. There's not a direct correlation that the more that you're persecuted, the better you will achieve your outcomes. So this sort of resistance, this pressure to conform, is the kind of thing that Jesus is talking about when he talks about persecution. But Jesus is talking about a specific form of persecution. Persecution on the basis of righteousness. Not persecuted for being difficult. It's not about being persecuted because you're selfish or you're obnoxious in the way that you share your opinions. It's not being persecuted because you evade the laws of society. Righteousness is a whole person life that accords with God's nature, his will, and ultimately his kingdom. To be living for righteousness is to have an earnest desire for what is good and right. It's a life that opposes bad and defends that's good. It's one whose heart is concerned with God's values. And it's actually seen most demonstrated in the life of Jesus. Jesus embodies the very righteousness of God. He lived for the will and pleasing of his Father. And so the righteous ones we've seen is those who follow and trust in Jesus. And Jesus sort of unpacks throughout his life what it looks like to follow him. And he does that by articulating where he's going. Persecution is a key part of Jesus' ministry and mission in this world. In John chapter 15, before leaving his disciples, he says this: "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you, a servant is no greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they'll persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also." Jesus is clear that opposition is a normal mark of being a disciple. As normal as hungering and thirsting for righteousness, as normal as being merciful, is this experience of receiving opposition, of being persecuted. Jesus came and lived as the Son of God, and he was resisted. He wasn't just resisted, he was actually despised to the point of an unjust trial, unjust punishment, and ultimately humiliated in a painful, excruciating death. Jesus offended this world. And so any who follow him will also have this same relationship with the attitude of the wider world. Now, Jesus is clear here that to start following him requires a relinquishing of mastering our own life. It requires clarity that we are not the master, but rather we are putting ourselves as a servant of Jesus. To follow him is to relinquish control of our life, to set our agenda below his, to realize that he is the only worthy master. Now, the question is, with Jesus saying, "Blessed are the persecuted because of righteousness," is he just sort of setting up a way of living for people to suffer? Well, the key part is that Jesus isn't asking people to go on a path that he hasn't already been on. He's actually just presenting what the path following him entails. Well, if we're going to take Jesus' words seriously, it does pose real questions about a recent debate in Australia about the need for a religious discrimination bill. Is it really necessary? If Jesus says, "Blessed are the persecuted," should followers of Jesus even be advocating for such legislation? Well, I don't think it should be advocated for so that you can live a life where there's never any resistance to your faith. But it also shouldn't be ignored because Jesus says, "Blessed are the persecuted." Personally, I think it seems that advocating the kind of society where faith can be expressed, where faith can truly exist for all individuals, where people have the opportunity to direct their faith in whatever direction they find, is actually good for humanity. And it's actually a great opportunity for people to consider and hear about Jesus himself. So hearing that the persecuted are blessed doesn't mean that we try and advocate for conditions where we'll never get any opposition, or try and build a framework where everyone has to agree with us. Because Jesus is saying, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Jesus is talking about the eternal reality rather than the present, where persecution will truly be seen in its place. The kingdom of heaven is the kingdom that Jesus himself is establishing. He's able to establish it because he is the truly righteous one. And the reward for those who hold to him and follow him is that they will be citizens. And now we heard about this earlier in the Beatitudes. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will inherit the kingdom of heaven. And so those who also are holding to Jesus will, when they're receiving persecution in this world, have as a confidence their citizenship in heaven. You see, to become like Jesus, to be growing in conformity towards him, means that there will be a reaction against us. Persecution is inevitable if we continue to follow the ways of Jesus, if we continue to hold to what he says is good, to not compromise our values and beliefs, to not conform to this world and its way of thinking and expectations for life, but rather to conform to Jesus and the life that he's called for us, means that there will be resistance. Now, Jesus isn't condoning persecution. He's not about pursuing persecution, but he's realizing that persecution now gives us a great hunger for the reality that is available through Jesus. There will be a life where true blessing and harmony will exist. And persecution because of righteousness is a signal of our true citizenship of the kingdom of heaven. So if we stop and reflect on this invitation to follow Jesus, to live a life in conformity to him, the question is, do we demonstrate the nature of a citizen of the kingdom of heaven? Are we hungering and thirsting for righteousness? Or is our tendency to conform? One of the great pressures against following Jesus is seeking the approval and affirmation of those around us. You know, we see it in a conversation where we sort of know someone's view on a topic, and so we either just sort of blend with that, or that we are just silent about ours. There's a great danger to just sort of assimilate in our expectations for how we spend our time, the way that we prioritize things, the way that we allocate our finances, to conform to the normality of this world rather than valuing what Jesus says is a priority. There is a difficult question if we don't feel that we are receiving any persecution. The difficult question is, what place does righteousness have in our life? Are we receiving no opposition because we aren't increasingly hungering and thirsting for what God says is right and good, but rather we have just given up and rather are conforming to the world around us? Jesus, the righteous one, has established a kingdom of heaven, a kingdom that will last. His invitation is for all to find that as their true home. That true home is where the ultimate blessing will be received. But there'll also be blessings now in the face of opposition as we see God working in us, strengthening our faith, as we see God using us as a great witness to his people and to this wider world, that he offers hope in the face of death, that he offers life in the face of opposition. Now, there are many across the world who are facing persecution for faith in Jesus, but this is not the exception. The degree might be different, but the norm of following Jesus is to receive opposition. This is an opposition that we go and seek out. To follow Jesus is to go and seek out righteousness, to be pursuing an understanding of what God says is good, and then embodying it in the decisions and actions that we demonstrate in our life. For those who continue to grow in hungering and thirsting for righteousness, there's a promise of blessing. Blessing now, of being reminded about what God is doing in you, but also the blessing of a citizenship in the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom that lasts forever, the kingdom that cannot be overthrown, the kingdom that cannot just fade away, the kingdom that not even death or disease can destroy, a kingdom that lasts. Friends, are you pursuing that kingdom? Are you growing in loving righteousness? Don't let the fear of persecution strip you of this great and abundant reward that God is making available through trusting Jesus, the truly righteous one.